This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We're having a big internal debate at the Dispatch about how much should we have standardized formatting, verbal formatting, auditory formatting for these podcasts, so that we sort of date stamp them up front so people know exactly what's going on, particularly when we're talking about like breaking news stuff. I generally think it's a good idea, even though, of course, this podcast is timeless. This podcast is as timeless as the conversation among philosophers that the Straussians care so much about. So today is Friday, December 20th. It's 9 a.m. I've already been up for 5 hours. I did CNN this morning at 6 a.m. and I woke up too early. I have this problem where if I know I have to wake up early, I don't sleep well because I'm afraid of oversleeping. So I end up waking up earlier than I set the alarm for. And this happens to me whenever I have an early flight, when I have an early TV hit, when I got to drop off the money or the yayo. It's always a huge problem. Anyway, not because I'm not working next week, but because we, in the beneficence and magnanimity of Dispatch leadership, want our workers to be home with their families and having a good time. We're putting a bunch of remnants in the can so that you have that rich, meaty content you crave out there in the real world, while at the same time our people don't have to put it all together. And also, it's very difficult to get guests on a podcast the week of Christmas and Hanukkah. So in that spirit, friend of the podcast, friend of the host of the podcast, coming up, not quite at Starwalt levels of repeat appearances, but close. We have none other than Tevi Troy, now at the Reagan Institute, where he's a senior fellow. His most recent book, The Power and the Money, The Epic Clash Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry, which was named one of the best books of the year, I believe, by both The Economist and The Week. And for the trifecta, the Remnant podcast, none other than Tevi Troy. Tevi, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thanks, and Jonah, knowing me, you know I will use that, so thanks very much.
So I got to say, so I had Musra Al-Gharbi, which I believe is the correct way to pronounce his name, and if it's not, it's just because I'm on a vision quest right now. He might have beaten the Troy record of most references to his book in a Remnant, but he had far fewer mentions of title. He would just say, he began almost every fourth sentence, and I don't mean this as a criticism. We understand this world, but and it takes an enormous amount of discipline. But he would begin every third or fourth sentence. I argue about this in the book. I write about this in the book. This is in the book, and it was impressive and a little overwhelming. So
yeah, I actually listened to that interview, and I had not heard of him before.
Yeah.
I did find his constant in the book a little disconcerting, especially since he didn't mention the title, but the title is a bit of a mouthful. But I thought it was a fascinating conversation, and I just want to say that I find a lot of interesting conversations on the Remnant. I would never compliment the host because I know he doesn't like compliments, but the guests are very interesting. Sometimes people I haven't heard of, sometimes people I know very well, but really people who are thinking about where things are going and put a lot of effort into trying to be normal, sane, and thoughtful in these difficult times.
Thank you, Tevi. That all said, it just reminds me, it's like when we were both policy gnomes in Washington, D.C. in the early 90s. I'm not saying we read everything, but we kind of read about everything. Like, between the two of us, there were probably very few relevant book reviews in the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post Book Review, the New Republic, maybe National Review, certainly Commentary, and maybe not just the two of us, but like our little circle. And I sometimes try to figure out, is it that I'm just getting too old to be to stay on top of all that stuff as much as I used to? Is it because social media is frying my brain? Or is it that as I become more cantankerous and curmudgeonly in my remnant-deedness, I just find that there are very few new arguments that I find all that compelling, and I find I kind of I see so many of the oh, I've heard this before kind of stuff, and I'm just like, okay, I get it, and I move on. I mean, maybe it's like a heuristic kind of thing. I don't mean to be arrogant, but do you have this problem that, like, I mean, there was a time 30 years ago we would have known who that guy was much earlier. Like, I didn't
Yeah,
know he
well,
was a
there's
best-selling
two
author
things
until
going on.
fairly
So,
recently.
first of all, when we're in our 20s, all these ideas are new to us. So that's one thing that we're
Yeah.
excited about, hearing things for the first time. But the second thing is there's so many more outlets. You could be on top of everything back in the 90s because there was much less to cover. Our friend John Podhoretz has made this point about movies. He saw pretty much every movie ever from that period of, let's say, 1930 to 1990, when the Hollywood studios produced the movies, and it was a relatively limited number of movies. So he had this encyclopedic knowledge of almost every relevant movie. But in the last 40 years, there have been so many movies from so many places that it's hard to keep track of all of them. There's something similar going on in the intellectual world. There's so many more outlets, so many more places to keep up with. And also, the weakening of the mainstream media has made them less mandatory reading. You don't have to read the New York Times book review every week. And in fact, if you do, you're probably less prepared as a result. And then the last point I'll make for this is that for people like you, who are not just policy gnomes who try to absorb information, we also try to have outlets for our information. And for me, there's so many more outlets where I can write and put out content. So in the 90s, if I wanted to put out an op-ed and I couldn't get it in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, Commentary, National Review, there was nowhere to go. And now there are so many more places to go. And I know you have a home, meaning you write your stuff with the Dispatch. I write my stuff from multiple places, and having those multiple outlets is helpful to me, but having so many places to keep up with is more difficult.
Curious, when was the last time you deliberately, I'm not saying like you clicked on a link by accident or there was a Drudge thing or a Twitter thing or whatever. When was the last time you actually deliberately went to the Washington Times? Never mind, picked up. Do they have a hard copy anymore?
They do, but the thing with the Washington Times is that their website is very glitchy.
Yes.
And once you go on their website, you get stuck with all these pop-up ads, and it's a disincentive to going there. But I would say within the last 3 years, I saw something interesting, usually by someone from Foundation for Defense of Democracy or something like that.
Sure, fair. I'm not saying everybody who writes for it is bad or anything like that. It's just like there was a time where, because there was much more of an institutional headwind at a lot of, there's a scarcity problem with the Wall Street Journal. They can only take so many op-eds, right? And then there was a bias issue with the Washington Post and the New York Times. And because the Washington Times was in D.C. and people like us kind of looked at it, like it got more attention than certainly its news pages would warrant. But, and do you remember this? Remember in the 1990s, there was this fierce competition with various consultants for questionable regimes in the third world who all wanted to have and they all put their op-eds, in favor of or against Jonas Savimbi or whoever, because the regimes that they were working for, consulting for, really didn't understand what the Washington Times was, and they just thought, oh, like it's like the New York Times and the Washington Post combined, and it's in the nation's capital. And it was always sort of fun to do the criminology about like why this piece was in there, what client was being billed at 10x for this great public publicity campaign kind of stuff.
Yeah, but I would say that in the absence of alternative conservative sources, the Washington Times was very useful in its time. And in recent years, because of the proliferation of alternative conservative sources, which is a good thing, and because of the glitchiness of their website, people go to it less.
All right. I did not plan on talking to you a great deal about the Washington Times. I didn't really plan on very much at all. It's that time of year. It's Christmas parties. It's Hanukkah parties. The White House already had its Hanukkah party because President Biden had to get to Delaware. It was urgent. You wrote a book called "Shall We Wake the President," which had a completely different connotation for that phrase. Right? It was about like a crisis breaks at 3:00 in the morning. Is it worth getting the president up to deal with this crisis right now? And it could be a plane crash, it could be an earthquake, it could be a terrorist attack, it could be all sorts of things. In the Biden era, "Shall we wake the president" is something someone could say to the person sitting next to them at a meeting with the president. What the Wall Street Journal had this big piece that came out. It was online on Thursday. It was in the hard copy this morning on Friday. What'd you make of it?
I thought it was frightening. I mean, this idea that the president has good days and bad days, he can only be briefed on the good days, and that they're trying to keep him from bad news, and that you can't put out a good press release about Jill Biden because anything good you say about Jill Biden makes the president look bad. I mean, it was showing that the president's not there. And people like you and me have been writing about this, joking about it, talking about it for years now. The mainstream media ignored it until that disastrous June debate, when that's all they could talk about. And then suddenly, when Harris stepped in, then Biden was back to being this brilliant sage who realized his shortcomings, but was still a great guy and belonged on Mount Rushmore. And then once he lost the election, or at least Harris lost the election, the Democrats lost the election, then suddenly we're back to Biden and his senescence and how terrible it was that he was ever president.
Again, time is all messed up here because I recorded the solo Remnant last night as a favor to Adam. Again, trying to get all our stuff cleared this week. So I talk about this. I ramble about this a little bit on that. But some of our friends are really laying into Kamala Harris about how she was part of the cover-up. And I don't dismiss that, and I don't really super dispute that. But it seems to me like in the annals of American history, there are very few moments where you would expect a vice president to throw the president under the bus. And so in some ways, like her covering up Biden's senescence makes me angrier at Biden and his advisors and at Jill than it does at her, because like it's part of that job to get the president's back. And at the same time, does his sundowning reach the point where your personal loyalty to the president kind of has to take a back seat? Maybe, but it doesn't mean she would say it in public first, right? I mean, like the only vice president you wrote a book about the presidency. You would have a better memory about this. Actually, you wrote several books about the presidency. Mike Pence on January 6th is really the only example I can think of in the modern era where a vice president really had like a first order obligation to break with the president publicly on a matter of statesmanship. I mean, can you think of a time before that? And so anyway, my point is, I don't think what Harris did was good, but the campaign's over. I don't think she's ever going to be president of the United States. And the issue really isn't Harris's cover up of it. It's the administration and Biden and his wife and their decision to be a one-termer much earlier that I think is the real scandal, and not the Harris stuff. But maybe I'm missing something.
No, I think you're right in the essentials. First of all, that Mike Pence's break was the biggest break in certainly recent political history, but probably in total political history of a vice president.
I can't think of another. I mean, maybe something with Jefferson or Adams in that era that I'm missing.
Adams, definitely, but that was a long time ago. So in recent political memory, it's the biggest break. I think in terms of Harris, look, she was part of the cover-up. I think the worst is not that she didn't publicly make a stink about Biden, because again, that's not the role of the vice president, but any time that she publicly said something that we know to be false, that, oh, he's really on top of things, that's bad. But look, she paid her dues on this, right? I mean, she said there's not a thing different that she would have done from President Biden. And that was the most damning thing she said in the entire campaign, of a lot of problematic things she said. But I think that line, more than any other line, is why she was unable to win the presidency.
No, I think that, or not just that line and the fact that she repeated it, right? I get messing up that line the first time, but then getting all the blowback that she got, going back to campaign headquarters, having a conversation about it, and no one comes up with a line that you can use the next time you get asked that, is so bizarre to me. I mean, because I can, between the two of us, we could sit down with a legal pad and come up with 15 or 20 things you could say that sort of sound like breaking from him, but really not anything that he would be able to object to. Things like, look, we all learn from the experience of governing, and so obviously there are things that we would do differently. But I'm looking about facing the future. I mean, I'm just freelancing here, but like you can think of a
Your
bunch.
freelance is better than anything she said.
Yeah, I mean, like it's not that hard.
There is a story to be told that we don't yet know about the inner workings of the Harris campaign. And I don't know if it was her flaws or her staff's flaws or the weirdness of the links to the Biden administration. They felt like they couldn't say certain things. But I hope that, I don't know, Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes write another book about the inner workings. Because if you remember, they had that book about how messed up the Hillary campaign was
Yeah.
in 2016 that nobody was talking about for all of 2016. And then suddenly Trump wins and they put out this book and we say, wow, that Hillary campaign was really dysfunctional. Maybe a journalist should have told us about that beforehand.
Yeah.
But there was something wrong in the operations of the Kamala Harris campaign. And I don't care if the Harris staffers went to Harvard, the JFK school afterwards and said, we ran everything great. There was something very wrong in the operations. And I don't yet know what it was, but I do want to find out.
So I want to get to your piece and commentary, which again, full disclosure, in my conversation with Richard Reinsch, which was really interesting, and I like that guy a lot. I mentioned that article in there, so people maybe get confused about how it's just
playing with the time streams. It's like
it's very complicated. I feel a bit like Matt McConaughey going back and messing with the books on the shelf in Interstellar. Let's
go for an older reference. Woody Allen in Love and Death, where he says old Gregor is younger than young Gregor because of some kind of mess up with a condom in a time machine. Wasn't that the line?
I do not remember. I'm actually very bad on Woody Allen.
So is the rest of America now.
Yeah, well, Woody Allen's kind of bad on Woody Allen. I can do what was his name? Hurricane Hippo, the one who had the time machine in his hot air balloon.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
And of course, Hot Tub Time Machine, which is really one of the classics of the genre. But I was going to get to something. Oh,
commentary piece, Richard Reinsch.
Yeah, the commentary piece about how much the current moment we're in can be ascribed to Obama, and I'll get to that in a second. But first, I just want to ask a question. Put on the rank punditry hat for a second and the hip boots. How much, in your opinion, do you think the electorate voted? And I understand there's semantic issues here, but how much of the margin of victory for Trump was about voting for Trump versus voting against Harris?
Yeah, look, we're in a country that's basically 48-48, and then the other 4% or determine what happens in the election. And so Trump has had a solid 45 to 48% of the electorate. People are going to be with him regardless. And I think she gave that other 4% no reason to vote for her. So I think her awfulness as a candidate had a lot to do with it, but also the problems of the Biden administration. In the Trump administration, every day you read the Washington Post or the New York Times and you read about chaos inside the White House. This person's firing that person. This person's leaking on that person. But in the Biden administration, every day you read about chaos in the world, meaning Russia is attacking Ukraine and Israel's being attacked by a horde of terrorists and inflation's out of control. And I think the American people said, I'd much rather have internal chaos of those crazy people in Washington fighting each other than external chaos in terms of all these bad things happening in the world. And I think that backdrop, more than anything else, is what led to the structural situation that meant that Trump was likely to win this election against almost any Democrat who was unable to step away from what the Biden administration had been doing.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is I think we are, and that's why I want to get to the commentary piece. We are poised for yet again a replay of this dynamic where a party wins a national presidential election on the claims that if they don't win, the world is going to come to an end. They get in there, and then with a fairly narrow majority, I mean, Trump's victory was real and decisive. It was the 44th largest electoral college win in American history, so it was not a landslide. Trump posted the other day that he has the largest mandate in 129 years, and everyone I know is sort of like trying to McKin what when what but the point is that these presidents, they get in, they think they have this sweeping mandate, or they think if we are going to get thrown out of power the next time we're up, so we better shoot for the moon and get all this like stuff done. And they think that the people in their bubble are the ones who have get to define the mandate, right? And so Biden gets in, thinks that he can be the new FDR just because those, Doris Kearns Goodwin and Michael Beschloss and what's his face.
John Meacham, I think, gets the most blame here.
Yeah, John Meacham. And then, there's that great Abigail Spanberger thing saying nobody voted for him to be FDR. To which Michael Tomasky said, "That's not true. I did." Which is just the dumbest friggin' thing. But anyway,
dumb but true, right?
And so, like, Trump is the people who gave him the majority, right? The people who moved directionally rightward in all these states where he didn't run, like Southern Texas, where these Hispanic communities have moved towards him. I don't think that they voted for Elon Musk to be a huge disruptor in Congress and kibosh a budget deal going into the Christmas break. I don't think that they voted for like criminal prosecutions of Liz Cheney. They voted for like lowering inflation, maybe doing something and certainly doing something about the border, getting the economy right, and that kind of stuff. And to me, it's analogous to Biden. Is like these people think that their mandate is something different than it is, and then they act on it, and then the voters say this is overreach, and they punish them for it. And you do have a good piece in commentary that sort of lays out how really it's Obama who sets a lot of the sort of parameters for this dynamic with his fight over Obamacare. So why don't you sort of lay out your thesis there?
Yeah, so first let me start by giving another kudos to our friend John Podhoretz, because John came to me with the idea. He's written and talked about how Commentary is an editor's magazine. They come up with ideas and they try and find the best writer for it. So I have pitched articles to John and he has accepted them. But the majority of the articles I've written for Commentary, and I've written a number, have been from his idea. And he and Abe come to me and talk about what we should write about. And so this idea was about how the overreach of the way they got Obamacare passed. But again, they didn't have a majority that could do everything. They had bigger majorities than Biden had, but they didn't have the filibuster-proof majority after the Scott Brown defeat after Scott Brown won the upset win to take over the Kennedy seat. And so they said, we're going to get this done by hook or by crook. And they started to use all kinds of maneuvers and processes that led to this thing being passed in a way that felt to the American people like this was being forced down our throats. Now, again, he had bigger majorities than Biden or Trump did, but he was still forcing this through in a way that was different than the normal processes. And I also had this piece that didn't actually make the final cut of the article, this argument that you could even see the beginnings of lawfare in there, because Ted Stevens, the Alaska senator, was subjected to this really unfair prosecution. A guilty verdict came down against him the week before the election. He lost, again, a Republican loses the Senate election in Alaska. And then afterwards, we find out that the prosecution had evidence that said that he should not have been convicted. And if that had happened, he probably would have won. The Democrats never would have had a filibuster-proof majority. So again, there was all these kinds of maneuvers that were taking place to put Obamacare through in a way that was not necessarily what the majority of the American people wanted. And then once it was done, and Obama understood this, if I get this through, it will never be undone because of the difficulty of changing things in Congress. And so they were determined to get it through. They got it through. But the ways in which they got it through, I think, were alienating to many Americans, but also disruptive of many of the norms of how you go about politics.
Yeah. So like, um, the only thing I'd add is because I've written about it a bunch of times is the I think the for some reason the phrase "fons et origio" keeps coming into my head. The starting point of this, you could argue, is actually the fight over the stimulus. That really early on, right, to deal with financial crisis stuff, where Obama comes up with a plan where he thinks he's given Republicans what they would want, but he doesn't actually consult Republicans on it. And instead he decides to just do it through Pelosi and Schumer. And back then, um, Obama had like 70% approval ratings, at the very beginning of his administration, um, and I think some of that was social desirability response and that kind of thing. But anyway, there were political consultants I remember talking to at the time who were like terrified that Obama was going to get like a third of the Republican caucus to vote for this thing. And if that had happened, Obamanomics for the next 2 years would have been bipartisan, right? You would have been able to say this was Washington's response, not Obama's response. And Cantor and Boehner and Ryan and all those guys took a real flyer in defying him on it. Because if it had worked out, then Obama would have gotten all the credit and they would have gotten, looked ridiculous. And the lesson there was you can defy Obama and not pay a political price for it. And that was sort of the other side of the coin of Obama doing everything unilaterally as if he was a parliamentary leader rather than as a president, was that the Republicans had inculcated in them from Obama's heavy-handedness a sort of like, we're not going to be part of any of this kind of thing. And I remember at the time being really annoyed how all these liberal pundits would say, oh, it's just because the GOP is racist. And it's like, it's just really not the way it worked.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things going on there. First of all, is that sense that you correctly identify that initially, after Obama wins, there was a sense that he was going to be some kind of steamroller and that you shouldn't oppose him. And I remember I had just left government that time and I was trying to make my way as a writer. And I wrote some piece that was critical of the stimulus and the way they were going about it. And some guy who had worked in the Bush administration with me called me and said, you're not going to be able to get a job in this town if you criticize Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, I was shocked that he said it. Second of all, that person later ended up in the Trump administration, which I think is kind of funny. But I was a little stricken by the comment, and I called one of my mentors, Elaine Chao, and she said, that's ridiculous. You've got to write what you think, and you've got to say what you believe and what you think is the right thing to do, and that's the only way to go about this. And she was right. I hate to give compliments, but I talked to a lot of people in that period about how to go about being a writer, and you were one of the people who gave me helpful advice in that period. And I won't belabor it because I know you don't like it, but it's hard to go from just government all the time to doing this writing thing all the time. So that was one point, that there was a sense that Obama was a steamroller. The second thing was, some people have an asset that can also be a fatal flaw. Obama has this, he exudes confidence. He has this huge confidence, but it could also be arrogance. And that arrogance, I think, is what alienated a lot of people. And remember, he said that thing to Eric Cantor, which I have in the piece: the election's over, Eric, and I won.
Right.
He was completely dismissive of any ideas the Republicans had to say. And then when he loses, when he lost in any legislative battle, Republicans said, "Hey, maybe we can beat this guy." It was like the old thing from Star Trek, "Behold the God who bleeds," right?
Right.
So the idea that he was going to win everything, and then suddenly, well, maybe this governing stuff is a little harder, and maybe he can't do everything, and maybe he's really arrogant and alienates us, led Republicans to say, okay, we can fight this guy. We're not going to go away forever. And as we know, Republicans won the House in 2010 and the Senate in 2014, presidency in 2016. So it reminded me a little bit of 1974, when the Democrats completely wipe out Republicans in Congress, and the Republicans are thinking this is the end of the GOP. And by 1980, they won the presidency with Ronald Reagan. They won the Senate with in that 1980 race for the first time in a long time. And then also they had effective control of the House because of the Southern Democrats who were willing to vote with Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth, I find a lot of these postmortems on the Harris campaign, Schadenfreude-tastic, and they give me a lot of, as I'm sure you have occasionally this feeling as well. They give me some deja vu for Wattenbergian arguments, because our shared old boss Ben Wattenberg was one of the leaders of the movement to move the Democratic Party back to the center after its excesses in the 1960s and 1970s. And they're not the same arguments today, but they definitely rhyme. But one of the things that I just don't think anybody has really come to grips with is that whether you call it arrogance or confidence or hubris or whatever with Obama, the the people who paid the biggest price were moderate Democrats, right? Just like the moderate wing of the Democratic Party was, I'm not going to say decimated because that's technically not the right word, but um, it was crushed, and as a result, the, the center of gravity of the Democratic Party moved wildly to the left because Obama wanted to create basically a parallel institution. He didn't really care about the party. And so the blue stateliness of the Democrats intensified because there was so little red left to make it more purple, right? And I think that's sort of, if you're going to write the story about Biden, that's one of the places where Biden's real problem comes from, is that he was never a centrist. He was this guy who was a centrist within the ranks of the Democratic Party. His boss destroyed one of the goalposts of the right wing, the right wing of the Democratic Party. And so that moved the center of gravity leftward, and Biden had no idea how to actually be a right winger of his own party. He only knew how to be a centrist of his own party. And so the AOC types and the Bernie Sanders types pulled him wildly to the left. And I think he got elected in 2020 riding on the fumes of his prior reputation. But then he had no muscle memory and very little gas in the tank left to actually, stand up to his own base, which I think would have helped him enormously.
Yeah, I agree with that. He's completely incapable of doing a sister soldier moment, which is not what you would have thought if you looked at Joe Biden in the 1990s. He would have kind of looked to jump on a sister soldier moment. But I agree with you also about this whole idea of the Democrats going so far left and this argument against them, and let's try to moderate, rhyming with what happened in the earlier era. But one of the reasons I think that the Democrats will have a harder time making the corrections that they made in the 1990s that got Bill Clinton elected is because of exactly what you say, that all the moderate Democrats were kind of wiped out. The congressional caucus, so the House caucus of Democrats, is made up of, to a very high degree, Democrats from California, New York, Massachusetts, and Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
Those people are on the left, and they're going to be on the left, and it doesn't matter if you have Musa El-Garbi and Jonathan Haidt and Barry Weiss and all these people who are on the left and moving right, come on and say, well, the Democrats don't go so far left. Those people don't care, and those
Right.
people aren't going to change. And so the new wave of neocons, and I know that they may reject the title, but initially when Michael Harrington came up with the title neocons, it was seen as a pejorative,
Right.
until Irving Kristol, in his wisdom, decided to embrace it. So anyway, this new wave of proto neocons, can we call them? They may not like the title, but they are speaking to a real problem in the Democratic base, but they may not be able to find that corrective within the current Democratic base.
Yeah, and it's also to add to that, I mean, you know this history better than I do, but the Democratic Party used to be like twice as big, just in terms of voters, as the Republican Party. Republican Party had a good shot at presidential elections, but congressional elections, it got washed away. And that was because the white working class, the FDR coalition, even if it was culturally conservative and like Reagan Democratish and would vote for a Republican president from time to time, it still liked all the sort of New Deal, Great Society kind of programs and labor policies and all of that. You could rebuild the right wing of the Democratic Party in the Clinton era because you still had enough of those kinds of those bubbas, for want of a better term, who were still vestigial traditional Democrats. like those kind of Democrats really don't exist in the South or in the Midwest the way they once did. And it looks like they're starting to evaporate in the Northeast too. And so it's like the party has fewer and fewer natural constituencies, which is something I would not have predicted even 10 years ago. I was just sort of like, party of government's getting bigger. More and more people depend on their income from the party of government. But my bad analysis in that was assuming that the Republican Party wouldn't also become a big government party. And so culturally right-wing big government party is going to beat culturally left-wing big government party.
Yeah, and I also think, we were talking about your analysis of how about the Roy Teixeira thing, which is almost a Shakespearean tragedy. I mean, he writes that the Democrats structurally are going to become the majority because the coloring of America, or it's going to be a majority non-white country, and that will inevitably lead to Democratic victories. And Democrats say, "Oh, we can do whatever the heck we want because we're going to win structurally," and they don't think that maybe you're going to alienate that rising majority of non-white voters by what you do if you go too far. And Teixeira wrote another book saying, "Hey, you guys didn't understand my message."
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, they did understand the message. They just took it the wrong way, and I think that led to a lot of problems for them.
Yeah, I feel very bad for Roy. He's now my colleague at AAI. I'm sure there's a better pop culture analogy, but the only one that comes into my head is where Ross constantly has to say, "But we were on a break," whenever someone gives him grief about cheating on Rachel. Like there's not a shoe shine guy or waiter on the Eastern Seaboard where he hasn't explained to them that he wasn't saying the Democrats could just jettison the white working class, right? He was like, if you add these other groups to the existing Democratic coalition, will be a permanent majority. And what they took from that book was, oh, we can just take young people and minorities and screw whitey and we'll be in power forever. And that was just not his point. But, this happens sometimes. People misinterpret one's books. I have no experience with that whatsoever.
No, and sometimes it becomes the dominant take on your book, even if that's not what you intended. So
right.
It's one of the perils of the business we're in, I guess.
It is one of the problems with the life we have chosen. But again, as I explained to people, we're in a sort of weird temporal cul-de-sac here. The story on Capitol Hill of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and blowing up the budget and maybe a government shutdown by the time people listen to this is fast-paced and moving in all sorts of weird directions. So I don't want to get too granular on all this. And I'm sure we talked about this when you came on for your book. But is there a parallel of Musk being, again, the richest man in the world and certainly the richest man in America and a captain of industry, getting so up in a president or president-elect's business that comes to mind watching this bizarre spectacle?
Yeah, the best parallel, and the one I talk about again in The Power and the Money, is about Henry Luce, who advised Eisenhower in 52, wrote what became the Democratic platform, or helped write what became the Republican platform on foreign policy, wrote editorials in favor of Eisenhower, provided staff for Eisenhower, had his wife become ambassador to Italy for Eisenhower. So Henry Luce was very involved in the Eisenhower campaign and was able to advise the Eisenhower administration to some degree, although not as much as he would have liked. And so I think that's the best parallel. But I still think that Musk is more involved, bigger, richer. It's I think it's the Luce story on steroids.
Yeah.
Situation.
Yeah. I mean, I just find it all very tragic because the guy was making good progress towards, and still is to a certain extent, but making good progress towards us being fulfilling his dream of making us an interplanetary species. And just as you and I and people like us can get bogged down and distracted and unproductive because of social media, he did it at scale and got so bogged down in social media he bought it and got sucked through the porthole into very online dementia. And I don't think it. If I had to bet right now, I don't think it ends well for him. I mean, I think it's like you mentioned earlier. I won and you didn't. When Obama said that, sort of like JFK saying about Nixon, "I'm president and he's not." At the end of the day, the Army, the Department of Justice, the administration is going to follow Donald Trump's orders and not Elon Musk's. And Musk is kind of playing with fire with an egomaniac like Trump. And like in Contest of Egomaniacs, I mean, it's an interesting one, but Trump can do, since he's a lame duck, can do more damage to Musk than I think Musk can do to Trump. I mean, maybe there's an Iran-Iraq war analogy in all of it, but I don't see how really this ends very well for Musk. But maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, he's proven people wrong like me before, so who knows?
Yeah, it reminds me of a couple of things. First of all, when he went on Saturday Night Live, he had this really telling line. I don't know if he wrote it or the writers wrote it, but he said, "Look, I'm Elon Musk. I remade the electric car. I'm sending people into space. Did you think I was going to be a normal, chill dude?" He takes a different approach to things.
Yeah.
The second thing is, I don't know what you mean by doesn't end well. I mean, we talked earlier about the misuse of the word decimate.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we actually use the word decimate to say his wealth is decimated by falling out with Donald Trump. The guy's still worth somewhere between 10 and $30 billion. So,
no, I agree with that. I mean,
not ending well could still be a very good outcome for him.
He's not going to be living off of ramen noodles anytime soon. I don't dispute that, but like, his business interests are really tied up in China. The electric car business is deeply enmeshed in sort of a subsidy industrial policy regime. Social media is still something that one bureaucrat can screw with you royally on. It's just not obvious to me that he comes out of this with his share prices and his agenda unscathed, right? The things he really claimed to want to do, I just don't think you try to steal the limelight from Donald Trump over the long haul when Trump is president and you're not. But maybe I'm wrong.
Look, there's a continuum. Continuum A is, or the far left side, the good side for him, is he gets everything he wants from the Trump administration, and I guess he's not born in the U.S., so he can't be the successor, but he's, a key advisor to Republican presidents for the rest of his lifetime. And the bad side of the continuum, the worst thing that could happen, is he goes to jail, which I think is unlikely. So at least somewhere in between, but in between, anything short of going to jail, which, again, I don't think there's anything he's done that would send him to jail. I'm just saying what an extreme thing government could do to you. Anything outside of that, he's still got a pretty good life.
Yeah. Again, when I say it doesn't end well for him, I don't mean it on. I mean it on. I'm grading on a curve here, right? I mean, he's clearly enjoying himself now with his access and all that kind of stuff. I just don't think that's sustainable. And again, you look at what, as a matter of policy, I'm closer to Musk than I am to Trump on this stuff, right? I mean, like Musk's position is he wants to cut spending, right? That's the whole Doge thing. And so he's attacking that bill because it's a classic Christmas tree, right? With all this stuff hanging off of it. Trump wants to get rid of the debt ceiling, which I'm actually sympathetic to. I think the debt ceiling is bad for the country. But he wants to get rid of it so he can spend freely and blow up the debt and deficit with, some tax cut stuff, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, and wall building and mass deportation and all this kind of stuff. Those are not the same agendas. And it is just not obvious to me that Musk has the ability to guarantee that his agenda wins and Trump's loses. But again, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, let me just raise something. I'm going to go a little off field here, but this whole idea of what could potentially happen to Musk raises an idea for a book thought that I've had for a while. I don't know if it's a good idea, but I'm sure the many agents who are in your audience might seize the day. But what about the greatest falls in American life? I mean, people who are at the pinnacle of American life who completely collapsed. You think of Rudy Giuliani or Charles Lindbergh or O.J. Simpson. I mean, these people who really had everything were on the top of their game, and everything went south for them for a variety of reasons, often self-inflicted, but still, you would never imagine the great falls that all these people encountered. So something
It's
I'm
not a bad
playing
idea. I mean,
is happening to Musk, but who knows?
I'd be curious about the 19th century ones because those are the ones that like are so far out of my purview. But like, I mean, Elizabeth Holmes would be one of recent note, right? I mean, like,
Yeah, she goes up there.
Greatest failures, right? The problem with it is like Americans like stories about how like people get back up and dust themselves off and get back in the race, and the whole point of the book would be no, these are all sad stories.
You actually wonder about someone like Jefferson Davis, right? I mean, he's the president of the Confederacy, and then he has to run away in a dress. So I mean,
Or
there are some related to the Confederacy of really bad.
Aaron Burr.
Mm.
He's got this, he tries to create like a kingdom in Louisiana,
Yeah,
and all sorts of crazy stuff. He'd be a good one.
and again, a lot of these are self-inflicted, right? I mean,
yes.
these are things people have done to themselves.
All right, so switching gears entirely. I'm just curious. I don't have a theory as to what the hell they think they're doing, but I'm curious if you do. The Luigi Mangion arraignment in New York, it's like Scorsese or Singer or some, or Tarantino storyboarded it, where they have him.
Talking about that picture with him in the orange.
Yeah, him flat, at the lead of a phalanx of cops, and there's another one where he's getting off the helicopter, and they look like promotion stills from the Joker. And I don't get it. And I was talking to a Democratic operative on CNN this morning who was saying how she'd been to that helipad where some of these shots were taken, and you can bring the car right up to the helicopter, and they opted not to do that so they would have more dramatic footage. And they actually had an NYPD videographer there to really capture all of it. And I just don't get like what they're thinking, or if they're thinking. I mean, I don't know if you have any idea, but I'm just kind of curious. It's just in my head.
I got to tell a great story that I think you will love from our old New York days, which is the mayor of New York in the 70s is the embattled Abe Bean, right? Seems completely out of his depths. Everything's going wrong in New York. And there's this serial killer, the son of Sam. And he gets a call one night after Son of Sam's been terrorizing the city. Come down, we've captured Son of Sam. And so he races down to One Police Plaza to go and congratulate the cops. And he walks in and he sees the shaggy-haired guy in an olive drab jacket. And he thinks it's the plainclothes detective who, through dogged work looking at parking tickets, has cracked the case. And he goes to shake the guy's hand, and up rise the manacled hands of David Berkowitz, the son of Sam himself, who shakes hands with the mayor. David Garth, who is the legendary PR guy for New York Politicos, he saw this and he said, "It's the photo op from hell." And so it just makes me wonder whether the NYPD, for all the good work they do, do they really know about stage managing and press relations? And maybe they need to think that stuff through a little more.
So it's funny you bring this up. I think it's Andy Ferguson, but this was a long time ago. Was given a talk at AI. God, I hope it was Andy. It was either Andy or PJ, but someone was talking about Dinkins, Mayor Dinkins. And for listeners who don't remember, I mean, it's very difficult to remember Mayor Dinkins. He was the mayor of New York right before Rudy Giuliani. He had been Manhattan borough president, and before he became mayor. And the thing to know about borough presidents, at least in our day, was they basically had one real power is they could name streets. And maybe there were a couple other things. They could close the street down for a block party, but that was about it, right? And so Dinkins' whole orientation toward politics was photo ops, because that's all he had the power to get. And it worked for him. It got him, elected mayor. And so there was a meeting with Dinkins as he's heading towards this election campaign with Giuliani, and he's meeting with the press and some sort of, I can't remember if it was off the record or editors. I think it was an editor. That's right. It was a meeting with the New York Times editorial board, and they're asking about the bond issue and what are you going to do about crime, and how are you going to refinance the Port Authority and all those kinds of questions. And he's like, he will not give up on his complaints about how he had visited Rome, visited the Vatican, and he's sitting there with all these cardinals, and they took a picture of it and they put it, but like on page like B12, the Metro section of the New York Times, and he's just reaming out these editors saying, "Did you see the hats on these guys? That was an amazing picture. What's wrong with you? Why wouldn't you put that on the front page?" And like, that's the only terms he could think of,
Yeah, well, obviously the stage managers and the NYPD are not understanding how the terms with which to think about this picture. And look, anything that leads to this guy being lionized any more than he's been, I don't think he should have been lionized at all, is a bad thing. And my friend Scott Jennings, who worked in the Bush White House with me, he had that great image where he said he showed up a picture of Daniel Penny and he showed a picture of Luigi, and he said, for Penny, good guy, and Luigi, bad guy. It's very simple. I'm going to explain it to you guys in terms you understand. And it's really disturbing to me that people don't get that.
Yeah, no, I find the Mangione story extremely depressing. If Penny had been convicted, I would be more obsessed with that. I mean, I think it was wrong to prosecute him, but I find it's really kind of amazing the juxtaposition insofar as Penny didn't plan on taking a life, and he did it in defense spontaneously. And you could say maybe it was bad judgment. I'm open to that. It doesn't mean it's deliberate homicide or anything like that. But he did it from a good place, right? And Mangione is just a premeditated friggin' murderer. I mean, there's no, and the thing is like, and we should probably talk about this for listeners who don't know. You were, even though I've mentioned it fairly recently on here, you were the number 2 guy to HHS. So whoever's number 1 back then, he would have been your Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And
I'm sure Michael Levitt will appreciate that.
Yeah, I just figured I'd get that in there. It seems to me like I've written a lot and ranted a lot about how I really hate this idea of debating healthcare policy based upon a conversation starter from a premeditated assassin. And the whole "I'm against murder but" thing, I find just repugnant. But we're now in a stage where like that argument is out there, and it presents a different kind of dilemma. Right? There's one thing to say, I'm not gonna reward that kind of thing. It's another when it gets to the point where people think there is no response to this. And there's now some polling out there that has like shocking numbers of young people saying that Mangione's actions were justified. And it breaks down mostly Democrat, but not entirely Democrat. I mean, there are a lot of young Republicans too. And like Ben Shapiro and some other people, when they denounced this guy, got a lot of pushback from their young fan base saying, you don't understand this, Mangione's on the side of the angels or whatever. Is it fair to say that, like, I mean, if you're going to pick villains, can't you make the case that, and again, I don't think they're all villains, right? I reject the moral framework, but since people are now just talking about healthcare policy generally, hospitals are the price gougers, but they've figured out a kind of brilliant way to not show you the bill, right? And so it's the insurance companies are essentially the bill collectors for the hospitals, but the hospitals have the doctors and the nice nurses and the people who take care of you. And and then they say, "Oh, we'll attack your insurance company directly. You can deal with them when you hear from them." And so the hospitals get to sort of use people as ATM machines, and then the insurance companies get demonized for it. And again, I don't. My point is, like, if you're going to do this kind of argument, you might as well at least understand the problem better.
Yeah, the way you describe the system, it's like the feudals in ancient Europe, where the nobles in that system would charge rent to the people for working the land, and then they'd have the Jews collect the rent.
Right.
And so the nobles were these great people who would show up at the bar and eventually occasionally buy a round of drinks for everybody, but the Jews were the guys who were taking the money from you, and that led to a lot of anti-Semitism. So yeah, I guess the dynamic is a very problematic one. And look, we need to fix some of the problems in our healthcare system. And as I lay out in the commentary article, Obamacare didn't do it. And no
Right.
serious analyst says, oh, wow, now we have Obamacare, everything's fine in our healthcare system. It's true, more people are covered after Obamacare, but covered in a very expensive and inefficient way, and in ways that are not going to address our long-term problems. It did not bend the cost curve down, and it didn't transform healthcare in the way he said he was going to do it. So he violated a bunch of norms getting there, didn't solve the problems, and now we're stuck with the results.
All right, switching gears in the time we have left before I go to bed. This morning on CNN, Casey Hunt asked us, and because the new Superman movie is coming out and the trailer's already been viewed 8 trillion times or whatever, who our favorite Superman was. And curious if you can guess who I named.
Christopher Reeves.
Wrong. And not George Reeves either.
Yeah, that was going to be my second pick. So
Dan Aykroyd as Herr Ubermann from the Saturday Night Live skit, What if Clark Kent had been raised in Germany?
And DC did that. What if Superman landed in Russia? That was a KGB operative. But I would not have guessed that, but it is a good call.
Are you looking forward to that? You were always a DC guy.
I was and am a DC guy, although Marvel has completely kicked DC's butt in the movies, so there's no doubt on that front.
Yeah.
And my son just told me last night that the trailer is out, and I am excited to see it. But he also said that there were some very strange back of the catalog characters who were in there, like Metamorpho.
I don't know who that is.
He could change into any element or something. So anyway, so there were some kind of like deep cut characters who were in the trailer. So I'm curious to see it just for that.
Yeah, so Pod, who's sort of the ghost of the feast here.
Third mention, one remnant.
Yeah. He has a whole riff about how stupid it is for Marvel to grab these obscure characters and plot lines from the comics, which only maybe 2% of the movie-going audience knows anything about, right? I mean, it's like that last Thor movie had the Godslayer. I don't remember what his actual name was. And that's like a storyline that I don't know anything about because I stopped reading comics in the mid-90s for the most part. But people are like, oh no, you have to read the original and this is so great and all this kind of stuff. And I'm sympathetic to that in part because it kind of reminds me of the conversation we were having earlier about presidents listening to the people in their bubble about what the mandate is, right? So like the mandate for Marvel and for DC or for these movie studios is to make movies that people want to see. And it is not to be incredibly loyal to the oeuvre, or to canon. And the fact that the nerds scream when they violate canon, and I'm one of the nerds who screams when they violate canon, should be something that doesn't bother you. And I just think there's an analogy there to politics. Is like the trick to politics is sometimes annoying your biggest fans. And we live in an age of political fan service. Anyway, just coming in my head.
I think it's a really great point. And there's another element to it that relates to politics, which is the more woke these movies go, the less interested people are in them. And so
Right.
there's a perception that Marvel got extra woke in the last wave of movies, which, I was pretty religious about seeing all the Marvel movies all the way through the conclusion of the Avengers saga. But I've gotten less interested in seeing them because I feel like with most of what Hollywood's doing is they're trying to force this wokeness down my throat. So I think that applies as well, as you don't want to do the deep cut fan service, but you also don't want to alienate the people who actually pay the 8, 10, 12, $15, whatever a movie costs these days, and are going to go sitting in the seats.
So actually, that raises something interesting. So I just had this guy Musa Al-Garbi on, and we talked about how we'd never been woke, and I'm very sympathetic to his thesis, which is not that we've never been woke, right? That's part of the problem with the title, is that it's a play on a pretty obscure book, one that I do own, called "We Have Never Been Modern."
Yeah, I was kind of annoyed when he explained the background of the title. It said basically the title is not what the book's about, but it's because I'm going to do this weird reference to some book that I had heard of, but is not really a canonical book.
It's again, I like the guy and I want to have him back on, but like it's a symptom of being way too deep in your reading and in your sort of academic niche, that your references bounce off of normal. Neither of us are normal, and when the references bounce off of us, it's a sign that for normal normals, it is going to have no purchase. But his argument, which I'm very sympathetic to, is that there are these spasms, which he has a lot of different theories about where it comes from. Uh, um, surplus elites, all sorts of things, right? But there have been these moments that have happened in the past. We came out of college at the end of the political correctness craze, or at the beginning of it, or in the middle of it, or whatever. And that was, to me, very much like a wokeness thing. The 1960s was a wokeness thing. And he argues that the 1920s, 1930s, which I'm struggling a little bit more with his thesis on that, was the first great awakening. It would not shock me if you went back to the 1890s in response to sort of Nietzsche and all sorts of stuff in Europe, that you could call that an awakening in parts. But I'm very sympathetic to that. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is, the reason why those Marvel movies got so woke was basically, it seems it was a order from on high from Disney, which got way out over its skis, right? Invited this backlash from DeSantis on all that kind of thing. And there was this period where I remember writing about it. Axios had this, what I thought was ridiculous. And I like Axios. I'm not trying to criticize them entirely, but like I think they actually created a beat with an assigned reporter on just covering, like, I can't remember their terminology for it, but it was like CEO engagement with social justice, right? And that you had to be sort of in the political conversation. And I thought it was fascinating, in part because it was probably a really smart business move to create this beat for all sorts of business model reasons for Axios. But I also thought it was just completely wrong in its analysis of what's good for these corporations, right? It's like, I'm a big stay in your lane guy. Don't get out over your skis on stuff that you don't have a vested interest in. And it feels now like, with all these DEI programs being shuttered and a lot of these schools, fixing themselves, and, places like Walmart changing their policies, that we kind of passed peak woke. And that the real sign is always when corporations smell the what's cooking. I'm wondering, you do a lot more stuff, again, with your last book about the intersection of corporations and politics. Where do you think the future of sort of corporate Fortune 500 or Fortune 50 wokeness is going?
Yeah, I do think they've realized that there is a backlash, and the great line in this, as always, is from Michael Jordan: "Republicans buy sneakers too." You don't want to alienate half the consumer base with putting out these ridiculous policy ideas or pronouncements that are just going to irk people and make them say, "I don't want to buy your product." So I think corporations have taken a lesson from that. That said, I don't think the HR departments are necessarily moving back in terms of all the internal this day, that day stuff that they give to all the employees, or the demands that you hire according to certain demographic profiles. So it's not going to go away completely, but I think it will be less overt in the future. But I also think you raise an interesting point in terms of the theme of this episode of The Remnant, which is don't get out over your skis. Don't overreach. It doesn't matter if it's that your so-called political mandate. It doesn't matter if you're a movie studio and you think because you have this successful movie series and suddenly you can force wokeness down people's throats, or if you're a corporation, don't get beyond the selling the product to people who are actually going to buy it. So maybe stay in your lane is a good message.
I appreciate you finding a theme for this episode of The Remnant, because I was sure you were going to finish your sentence with "Don't phone it in." Anyway, Tevi Troy, thanks so much for being on. Obviously, you'll be back on. And congrats again on the great success of your book, The Power and the Money, the epic clash between commanders in chief and titans of industry.